during the week, I got to watch a favorite movie of mine, mostly because of the actors involved. Uh, has anybody ever seen the movie or know of the movie Inherit the Wind? Inherit the Wind is the uh, quasi-documentary or story about the Scopes monkey trial that took place in the 1920s in Tennessee when the state passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in the schools. And Scopes was a high school teacher and decided that to prohibit the students from hearing this information or getting this information about evolution would be a detriment to them in their future life. And so he proceeded to teach about evolution and was promptly put in jail and put on trial. And I say that I like it because of the actors, because Frederick March played William Jennings Bryan. And if you know the history of the United States, he was quite, at one point, quite a progressive Democrat and served in various administrations. And in fact, ran for president at least twice, if not three times. But in that process, became very conservative and a fundamentalist Christian for all facts. So he was brought in to take the state side. And then Clarence Darrow, who, as the story is told, was a well-known atheist, took the side of Scopes. And Spencer Tracy plays that part. So it's quite amazing. One of the last movies that Spencer Tracy made because he was already old and growing ill. But to Pat's story about creation, at one point that Darrow has Wayne Jennings Bryan on the stand, and Bryan quotes the often repeated trope of fundamentalists and conservatives. If you look at the book of Genesis and add up all the years of the ancestors, you get to the point where one lived 700 years and one lived 500 years, and you can actually date and time when the act of creation took place, and it was like 6,530 years before Christ at 10 a.m. in the morning. I mean, what? To figure that out. Bishop Usher in the I forget now his dates, but Bishop Usher did this. So I always come back, and I'm a little off my script. I always come back to the story because one way to help fundamentalists who want to read Genesis literally is to ask them, as Darrow does ask Bryan on the stand, well, tell me, how long were those first 3 days if the sun and the moon that marks time aren't created till the fourth day? So whereas that first 3 days, 24-hour days? How could they do 24 hours if the sun and the moon isn't there to, well, anyway, you get the idea, right? So that, yes, indeed, millions and billions of years could potentially be there in the Genesis story. And I was telling Carla, I was in high school, I had become fond of fossils and doing some fossil hunting. And in the limestone cliffs along the Mississippi outside of St. Louis was one of the prime fossil beds in the Midwest. And I went out with a group to do fossil hunting and found, to my absolute delight, almost a fully intact trilobite. And if anybody is in silence and knows trilobites, they lived in the ocean, was the only creatures in the ocean about 350 million years ago, as scientists date them. And I was so excited about this that I brought it and to show my aunt Emma. And I said, Auntie, look at this. I found a trilobite that's 350 million years old. And she said with a straight face, I don't believe it. And I went, I got it right here. What do you mean you don't believe this? And she says, I believe what the Bible says. And right then I realized that we were never going to be able to talk about science or religion after that, because she was a Missouri Synod Lutheran who believed literally and fundamentally in the 6 24-hour days. And by the way, we didn't get an answer from the kids as to what's missing in the story. What's missing in this story? Humans, right? Yeah, humans. That they were not in the story. And of course, I guess we could include them in the animal story, right? If you wanted to do that. But in any event, Jim has a PowerPoint that I put together. And so back on script, I want to just have us all remember, I have to think that from the dawn of creation, that when people become somewhat conscious of the world and the environment in which they live, that all they had to do was walk out in the next picture, walk out and observe creation, observe the universe, right? What one of us, as little kids, would go out at night and marvel at the stars in the sky, right? I mean, we just do that. So our first contact with something outside of ourselves is to look up into the heavens and to see at night the vast array of stars. I remember one time driving, I had a class, believe it or not, in Gila Bend. So I was driving out probably around December, January, when it's dark by 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and driving down the highway to Gila Bend. And it's like there was light. It was dark, pitch black. I went, what is that light? And thankfully I pulled off the side of the road, which was not much room to pull off the side of the road on that old highway going down there. And I got out of the car, and across the sky was the Milky Way. It was just, when you live in the city, you hardly ever get to see that, right? And it's horizon to horizon. There it was. And of course, you know that the Milky Way is what? The edge of our galaxy, the edge, and that sits in this vast, vast array of stars and potential planets that now they're beginning to discover, right? Thanks to the Webb telescope. And so when you do that, you consider how vast the universe is. And I think that moved our early ancestors to not only begin in a quasi-scientific way, to put some meaning onto what they were experiencing and seeing. You can't help. I remember as little kids, I was scared to death. And growing up in the Midwest, there were frequent, severe thunder and lightning storms. How many remember that if you grew up in the Midwest and were outside of Arizona, which we don't have too many of in Arizona? And being terrified of the thunder and lightning. And my mother, in order to calm me, would tell the frequent response that often was told, well, it's just the angels bowling. How many got told that story? A couple people. Well, I mean, when you're 6 years old, you listen, and it really did sound like a ball being dropped down the lane, and a big crash with lightning at the end of it. And that calmed me down. Oh, okay, now it's something that I understand. And it's like, I hope that by the time I got to be 15, that I realized that wasn't true. That was not the story. That couldn't possibly be. How would there be angels bowling? And then you have to, get the science of it, and you figure out the science of it, the cold and the warm and all of that stuff, whatever that is. And then you get, okay, now I can understand it as an adult, where it's no longer something that I need to comfort me. Now it's something that I move into understanding. And so when we look at all of the creation, I have to tell you, the second picture on this, the Southern Ring Nebula, in 2021, I had the opportunity to go to Hawaii and to fulfill one of my bucket lists. And my bucket list was to take the tour that goes to the top of Mauna Loa, and one at 14,000 feet, whatever the Mauna Loa volcano is on the Big Island. First, to watch the sunset from up there, which was absolutely incredible to see. But even more, to have the chance to do some stargazing. And if you've been there or know of it, right, many of the observatories of the world have their observatories on the mountain because it's far enough above the Earth's atmosphere that it gives them clear pictures of the sky. And so there we were, and to lay on your back in the parking lot, looking at the stars, and the guide had a digital computer telescope, driven telescope, and he could type in, see, think of the advances that has come in the last 20 years, even 10 years. And he typed in the coordinates, and there he zeroed in on the Ring Nebula, and it showed up on his computer screen, because when you look at the naked eye, you can't see it. I mean, this is like 100 million light years away from us. And there it was, and it was like, oh my God. And to see the rings of Saturn was just like, wow, look at that. It was just absolutely overwhelming and amazing. So again, that the reflection on science leads us out into the world to find purpose and meaning, which is really what spirituality is about, but to understand it not in terms of how it benefits us, but just to stand in the awe and wonder about the things that are beyond us, outside of us. Excuse me. And so it's interesting that in looking at this, and I think the next slide, this comes from the Pew Research. And if you're not familiar with the Pew Research, if you want any statistics on what people think or what people are believing, the Pew Research Foundation is the place to go. It's just absolutely amazing. Type in, and we'll put this on our Facebook page, type in Pew Research Foundation, and then just put in any topic, any subject, and you'll find it. So I did it on the interplay between religion and science. And these are some of the things. I don't mean to bore you with this, but it's just an interesting perspective. The least religiously observant Americans are most likely to perceive conflict between religion and science. Some 73% of adults who seldom or never attend religious services say science and religion are often in conflict. Isn't that interesting? That if they're not, they may claim to be religious people, but if they're not going to church or involved in the conversation that we have, then they're going to think that religion and science is in conflict. Now, I have to be honest. We have to be honest about this, right? That if you look at the history, and I do this with my nurses, if you look at the history of science and religion, church mostly, you realize very quickly that they perceived a conflict. Just ask Galileo how he did with the church, right? Just ask many others through the time of history that when the church said, no, this is what you have to believe, and it conflicts with what you're saying, so it's obvious you have to believe what we believe. Think of what happens when the view of the universe was from the time of the ancient Greeks, Ptolemy, who said, as I observe things, and here's the first part of what science is about, as I observe things, it appears that the earth is at the center because it appears that everything is revolving around the earth. So the sun revolves around the earth, all the stars revolve around the earth. So the earth is at the center of the universe. Now just think for a moment, if you put the earth at the center of the universe and we put the church as the controller of the earth, then the church is going to say that's how it is. Along comes a Polish astronomer by the name of Copernicus. How many know of Copernicus? You should know who Copernicus is. He goes, thanks to the invention of the telescope that Galileo helped to create with him, He looks at he looks out of his telescope and he says, well, that's not what I see. The Earth is not at the center. Rather, the stationary object is the sun, around which the Earth and the planets and everything revolve. You can imagine how all the priests and religious leaders of the day felt about that, because that contradicted what they were preaching about. And now all of a sudden, if the Earth is not at the center, but the sun is at the center in this Copernican view of the universe, imagine what happens to the position that religion has in defining what truth is about. But all of a sudden now you've got multiple centers of truth telling, the church among one, but among many, thanks to the development of universities and higher education, that all of a sudden now, well, you see, this is what's going to happen later on in the story of evolution. But in any event, just a couple more, again, not to bore you with it. Most American adults, 68%, say there's no conflict between their personal religious beliefs and science. The most common source of disagreement involves beliefs about, you guessed it, evolution and creation. Just as Pat laid it out for us. 2/3 of Americans, and I think that's the next, 2/3 of Americans believe that humans evolved over time, 65%. About a third of US adults, 35%, say that humans evolved through natural processes, while about a quarter, 24%, say that human evolution occurred with the guidance of the supreme being. If you listen sometimes to what they talk about, intelligent design, how many have ever heard that idea? Intelligent design says that it just doesn't happen by chance, but rather that there's a great designer. This is a little bit of what the Enlightenment people like Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers believed, that there's this designer, divine out there, making sure that everything works in the way that it does. The public is closely divided about whether churches and other houses of worship should be involved in science policy debates, such as things about climate change. Oh boy, that's bad news in some churches, isn't it? To even say that climate change is happening by way of what? Human cause. Like the ozone layers, carbon dioxide, and now we're even going to start blaming the cows, for God's sake. That cows are a major contributor to methane, which is causing even more pollution in the world. So become vegetarians, and that way we don't have to keep raising cows that are destroying the environment. That's another subject, right? And people's religious differences do not play a central role in explaining their beliefs on a number of science-related topics. It's very interesting, and I have some diagrams here of different groups within Christianity and how they believe that there is, surprisingly, Catholics have a higher percentage, 73%, who believe in evolution, where white evangelicals, 36%, believe in evolution. Isn't that interesting? And by the way, several popes over the last century have said there is no conflict between the theory of evolution and what Genesis is telling us. Do you know that one of the most important observatories in the world happens to be in Arizona, run by the Vatican? The Vatican. It's very interesting. It's down near Stafford, down that way on the 10,000-foot high mountain. It's very interesting to think about that. What I want to do, and I'm taking too long, is to show you what the scientific method is, if you can see this. So that I've given you some ideas, and I just show this because it's a process. And I want to suggest that we can also apply this in our theology and our spirituality, in our religious thought, that the same kind of process goes along. It's not that somebody tells us to believe and we accept it face value as it's told to us, but rather we ask questions about it. And so the scientific process, step, asking a question about something you observe there, how you go out and look at the stars and you go, How is all that possible? That's the first question. That leads to doing background research where you kind of make some studies and you do some research and you do some learning about this. Then you construct a hypothesis. And hypothesis, as we said, the Big Bang Theory. I often think, though, about the Big Bang Theory to the children is if the Big Bang Theory happened, well, what was before the Big Bang Theory? What is it being bang? What is the explosion happening into? Nothingness? Well, I don't know. So it leaves lots of questions, and that's a part of the process, right? So experimenting to test the hypothesis. You don't just simply accept a theory. You got to do some experimenting. I was telling Carla there was a story yesterday on Nova that talked about the dogs of the world. How many every continent has dogs that have adapted to their circumstances. And they showed a story about a pack of dingoes, wild dingoes in Australia, that because of the forest fires that are being caused mostly by humans and by the drought, have now moved on to the beach in a very isolated place in Australia. And moving on to the beach has led them to adapt to this new environment that they find themselves in. And being adapted into that new environment means that, well, the food sources are going to be very different. It happens to be a beach where the leatherback turtles nest every year. And so the dogs have discovered that because these turtles nest, that they can dig up the nest and eat some of the eggs of the turtles. And so now their diet has completely changed. But you may say, well, wow, isn't that going to wipe out the turtles? Well, these turtles lay hundreds and hundreds of thousands of eggs. So 6 eggs per dog isn't going to wipe out the species, right? But it's that the advantage of the dogs doing this has kept away the prey that pick up the tiny little turtle babies and carry away. So there are no longer any birds of prey on this beach. So actually, it's a benefit to the turtles to have the dingo dogs out there. Well, I just suggest that story because it says, see how we adapt to the environment. So you test the hypothesis by looking at the evidence. And by the way, that's what our dear friend Charles Darwin did in The Origin of Species. Right? Test the hypothesis by doing some research and study and looking at the evidence of how animals and critters evolve over time, where their beaks get longer, whatever it is, that they are able to evolve over a couple of generations in order to live in their new environment. Too bad that we as humans are still not learning how to evolve when we live in the desert in the southwest of Arizona, and we still think we're living back east or up north, where we get our creeks and waters and pools, and there we are, right? So in thinking about this, moving on, I want to go back a minute to the scripture, and I'm already taking too long. The scripture to us today, because in the book of Job, the friends of Job are saying, you need to curse God because God has put you into this position. And this is just how things are. Have you heard that argument? This is how things are. You don't question reality when this is how things are. And so they've got a certain way of believing about reality. And God says to Job and to his friends, what you need to do is you need to go out and ask the animals what they think. Now, who would do such a crazy thing? Ask the animals and see what they think. And that's what the story is, Listen, put your ear to the earth. Learn the basics. Every living soul, every breathing creature. I remember listening to Elizabeth Johnson. I struggled with her book. And in struggling with her book, it was because she spent the first 4 chapters trying to explain to a non-scientific person what the theory of evolution was. I remember many years ago, somebody gave me the book because we got talking about physics, and I don't know why we were talking about physics, because I flunked it in high school. But somebody gave me the book by Stephen Hawking on quantum mechanics. Now, I don't know if any of you ever tried to read that book. I got 4 pages into the book and had no clue what he was talking about. And so that's how I felt trying to read this book. And I remember she said at one point, she said, if you look into the eyes, let's say those of us who have dogs, cats are a little more difficult to deal with. But if you look into the eyes of your dog, you'll see what truth is. And I thought, what? Seriously? My poor dog at the time would look at me and go, why aren't I in your lap? Why is the computer in your lap? And so one day I said, I'm going to try this. I put the computer down. My dog jumped up into my lap, and we stared into each other's eyes. And I started crying. And the reason was not because I actually saw God, but there was something in the way that my dog looked at me that put absolute trust and confidence in who I was. And in doing that, it expanded my understanding of creation itself. That one of the things that Elizabeth Johnson said is that what we've got to consider is that everything, and as the story of creation, one of the truths that the story of creation in Genesis tells us is that everything is connected. And you know what? That's a religious, a faith truth. But what are scientists telling us now? Everything is connected, right? They've done a study of the forest where they go out into the forest and they have discovered that the trees are talking to one another. And you go, what? That the trees, through their root system, have a way of detecting trees that are in stress, and they'll send extra nutrients through their roots to those trees that are in stress to help them out. And they've got evidence of that. They've got evidence that everything is connected in some way or another. And is that the greater truth? So you see what Elizabeth Johnson talks about is we can view religion and science as being in conflict with each other. Science has nothing to tell us, religious people, and religious people know better than scientists. And so we know what's right and what's true. And so the conflict exists, just as we've seen through the history of humanity, right? We also know that in terms of this, that maybe they should just exist separately from one another in independence, that they each have their own way of thinking and doing and being, and they've got certain goals and certain purposes, and the two of them just don't have a way to communicate with each other. And so there's an independence. Keep them independent, keep them separate, rather than finding a way to bring them together. That's the fundamentalist view. Conflict is fundamentalism, where we don't see that they have anything to say to each other. And independence, science has its world, religion has its world. But we also know that in terms of this, that there's another way, the dialogue. I've mentioned it several times. The dialogue means that we can come just like that. Think about it. That the first people who observed the heavens may have thought about science, trying to figure out what that was all about, but it led them into a deeper reflection on who they were as human beings, which brings about the spirituality and religion. So that it leads not away from faith, but leads us closer, perhaps, for those who are believers. A fourth approach that she says is integration. A dialogue taken one step further, attempts to bridge theology and science and seeks to have a synthesis of scientific and theological ideas. And the last thing, just to say that this idea of dialogue, how are we in dialogue with each other? And it's interesting, very interesting. I heard this story that the people who worked on the Hubble telescope were actually fundamentalist Christians. Now, isn't that interesting? They didn't stop the progress of science. but rather engaged it. So even though their beliefs were as strict and conservative, they understood that science needed to explore the heavens more fully. Finally, building a bridge. I think our role, and we know Carla and I were talking, when I was a kid, and this will be the last thing I'll say. When I was a little kid, nobody asked, nobody objected, nobody asked questions. That when they lined us up to get the polio vaccine, how many remember that? We did. Within 20 years, for the most part, polio was eradicated in the United States. And polio struck children most strongly within 20 years. You know now, because people are refusing to get the polio vaccine, that polio has resurged in various places in the United States. I had a nurse say she refused to get the COVID vaccine because she didn't trust where it came from. And I thought, and you're caring for patients in a hospital? I didn't say that. But I really wondered about that. We've come to a point, you know that I had a nurse who said to me, at the height of COVID, I had a patient's family come in and demand that we stop using the healing process that they were using because they wanted their mother to get the horse serum because they saw it on social media that would cure her of COVID. He said, I went berserk. We live in a time when science is being questioned from a religious perspective, when I want to encourage us that it doesn't have to be that way. Because the two aren't in conflict with each other. The two can be in dialogue with each other. And to support, as the children have learned, right? They were telling us, right? Billions of years this can happen. Fantastic. Fantastic. To understand that it's not a threat to us, the truths that science speaks and the investigations that science goes through. Because not to be in dialogue means we take that road of fundamentalism where we think we're right and everybody else is wrong. And it can only lead to more things like the Inquisition, the genocide of the world, and we use religion against science. That's a lot to think about and more questions, and I hope you got more questions because that's who we are as shadows. Ask and raise questions and to ask more questions and to move forward in a progression of knowledge and understanding and confidence in who we are as human beings in the world.